Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here with you for the second day. My name is Muetaz Al-Khatib. The MA Program Director in Applied Islamic Ethics at the College of Islamic Studies, Hamad bin Khalifa University. So I'm here to introduce Muhammed Komath. Dr. Muhammed Komath? No, Doctor? Muhammed Komath is going to speak about his paper, which is entitled Rational Force of Analogy, Qiyas in Law, a comparative approach between Islamic and contemporary legal theories. You will have 20 minutes, I think, or 15 minutes? Yeah, 15 minutes, yeah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala ali Sayyidina Muhammad. So, okay. It's clear? So, I'm Muhammed Komath. I'm Qatar Debate Fellow. Today I'm going to present the final version of my project with Qatar Debate. So I will be very briefly talking about it, not going into details and not complicating it, and to say what I truly want to argue. So basically, the project is about a comparative approach between legal reasoning in Islamic tradition and in contemporary Western traditions of philosophy of law. So I would like to start with a fundamental question: why we should do a comparative approach? And most importantly, today there is a strong resentment with this kind of comparison between non-Western traditions of law with the Western tradition of law, traditions of reason. Basically, through a comparison, they say that what happens is that you are doing comparison to kind of agree with the dominance of Western categories of reason. So when you are situating the Islamic categories of reason within the context of Western categories of reason, you're basically saying that that is the correct method, that is the true version of reason. This is a very dominant argument within humanities, not just about comparing between knowledge tradition, about any kind of comparison, any kind of attempt of translation. There are scholars who say the impossibility of translation, because each tradition of reason, each tradition of knowledge can only be comprehended within its own universe of discourse. So any attempt to translate it is basically problematic according to this narrative. But what I think is that, though it's problematic, I truly agree with that position, but we cannot stay fragmented. We cannot say that they have their own tradition, we have our own tradition without any dialogue. So there should be a kind of communicative action between traditions, not to find a consensus, not to reach a consensus, and not actually to create a meta language or something, but actually to make the dialogue itself as the normative. Making the dialogue itself normative. So a dialogue actually recognizes both the differences and the similarities. So this is I'm not taking the Western categories of reason to validate Islamic tradition, not to legitimize Islamic tradition, but I will argue, as I will show, that the categories within Islamic tradition has its own independent version of philosophy. But when we look into the way that both traditions are flowing into or moving forward, we can see similarities in the both. We can see that both are trying to answer the same questions, but at the final stage, at the end of the day, what we see is two different implications, two different philosophies. So basically, there are many works actually within this kind of comparing between two traditions of reason. I would say within Usul al-Fiqh, one of the most important comparison would be Wail Hallaq's. Hallaq actually concludes in his article that someone can say that the logic of Islamic law is more superior, or Islamic law is more logical than common law tradition or Anglo-American traditions of legal reasoning. And also there is an important work by Shahid Rahman and his colleagues, it's recently published, it actually compares the tradition of Jadal and Munazara, compares the tradition of analogy and understanding the qiyas in usul al-fiqh tradition and Jadal tradition with developments in logic. So these both are comparing, the first one comparing with the legal reasoning, the other one comparing with the logical tradition. So I'm not going to any kind of argument to say that Islamic legal reasoning is more superior than the contemporary legal reasoning, or I'm not proposing any kind of something from that can resolve something in here, but to say that we see the same form of, same explanation of logic in both tradition, but in the final end of the result is that they both are legitimizing two different versions of philosophy. That's actually kind of interesting thing, that both traditions, how they are using the same logic to emphasize or establish something radically different or something that is contradictory. So my case and source, so I'm taking one particular problem from legal reasoning. This problem is actually very deeply discussed within usul al-fiqh and within contemporary legal reasoning, the question of rational force of analogy. So analogy is fundamentally the way that law works. Law itself works so more in any legal tradition, as many scholars say, as many legal philosophers say, that analogy itself is the nature of legal thinking. So, but there is a question of why analogy is valid, why analogy is legitimate as a logical tool. So that is the problem that I want to explain from the both traditions. So analogy, as you also all know, analogy is basically doing comparison between two situations, that we see that in this situation there is something and this situation is also similar to another. So this particular property of this situation should be also in that case. But the problem with analogy is that in between any two situations, there are n number of dissimilarities as well. So when we are saying there is similarities, also there are dissimilarities. Then how you are making the conclusion? So unlike in deductive reasoning, in deductive argument, you can say by semantically, two premises leads to the conclusion. By the semantic itself, there is a leading to the conclusion, but we cannot see the same in analogy. So that is the problem. And particularly, this problem is very significant in law because law itself is relied upon the system of analogy. So if you are making a ruling in a particular case, there is an expectation that a similar case in the future will be also decided on the same. That is how every legal system works. Then we need a kind of a legitimate argument for why analogy is a valid form of reasoning within law. Basically, there is a very prominent legal thinker, a professor of law in Harvard, Scott Brewer. I will be using his method as my case study. So he classifies the answers to this challenge as skeptics and mystics, and then there is an approach which I would like to call logic of law. So these three responses, we can say that the first one is rejecting the analogy. They say that what actually happens in law is not analogy, but it's a form of deductive reasoning. So there is no analogy. What we think that is seemingly an analogy, it can also be reformulated into a form of deductive reasoning. So they reject analogy. In Islamic tradition, Ibn Hazm is a famous representation of this kind of approach. He basically says that syllogistic tradition or the deductive reasoning should be the validating tool of the fiqh itself. So he uses logic to show that to say that any argument in fiqh should be according to that. And he also says in one of his books that syllogistic logic is the only method that is valid and rational. Another thing is that they accept analogy as a practice, but they are not legitimating it using logic, but they are saying that because of the law itself needs to maintain its consistency. Law needs to be the consistent system. So that's why we should use it in law, even though we are not explaining its logical structure. Cass Sustain is actually one of a prominent legal thinker in West, and uses the same way of explanation. In Islamic tradition, I would say in the scholars before Ghazali use it to say the same, that what validates or legitimates analogical reasoning or qiyas in Islamic in fiqh is actually because the scholars in the past, the tabi'un and sahaba and the prophet, actually they did the analogy. They actually used analogy. So this tradition is kind of using the argument of the authority of law itself as the foundation of legitimating legal analogy. The third way is logic of law. They say that basically for any argument in law, you have to explain its logical structure, and then they say that for analogy, legal analogy, there is a clear logical structure that can explain the rational force. The rational force, I mean how the premises lead to conclusion. There is a clear logical structure, and we can show this in a clear logical way how this happens. So as I mentioned, there is in Usul al-Fiqh, Munkirul Qiyas, there is who accepts Qiyas as based on the Shara itself. For example, Ibn Rushd al-Jadd, the Maliki scholar, he basically says that Qiyas, al-amal bil-Qiyas mujawwaz aqlan wa wajib shara'an. Yani, so even though acting according to a legal analogy is compulsory because Shara actually had shown us to do this, and in the past scholars have done the same. Yani. The third method, I would say, that's Ghazalian method. So logic of law. Here I would like to take from Islamic tradition two representation of logic of law, Imam Ghazali and his two books. The first one is Al-Mustasfa, which is in legal reasoning, and the second one is Al-Muntakhal, which is in legal dialectics. And the two sources from contemporary legal tradition, one is Scott Brewer, he's basically from legal tradition, he's a philosopher of law, and the other one is Douglas Walton, the Canadian logician. When he is dealing with analogy, he's basically dealing with analogy as in law. So he thinks, he explains the logic of analogy when it is applied in law. And basically, analogy is used in every sense. In biology, in medicine, in all the scientific research basically rely upon analogy, but in those disciplines there is no need of explaining its logical validity. But within law, because as the law needs to rely on the analogy, and there is no rubrics, or there is nothing that you can evaluate the end result of an analogy, there is a compelling need to explain that. So Scott Brewer's method and Douglas Walton's method are kind of complementing each other and completing the two methods. And the same thing I would say in Mustasfa, and what Ghazali discusses in Mustasfa and what he discusses in Al-Muntakhal actually completes the Usuli method. So in Brewer's model, his central assumption is that analogy is valid not because it's a creative intuition. So the scholars like Cass Sustain and some other legal philosophers, they said that when a case is coming in front of the judge will assume something. There is a creative intuition happens in his mind that he will find this case is similar to some case in the past, a precedent. So that's how he does the analogy. But Brewer says that no, there is a clear logical method that happens actually. And Brewer shows this method as in three steps. The first step is abduction of analogy warranting rule. The second one is confirming that AWR, and the third one is application of AWR. I will show how this happens. So abduction is the first step of legal analogy. Abduction is a new form of logical argument that has been recognized since 19th century, I think. The Sam Pearson, the famous American logician, he is the one who proposed it. In abduction, it's a form of legal inference that seeks the most likely conclusion from a set of observation. I will give you an example. For instance, when we notice that the lawn is wet, and observing that the lawn would be wet if it had rained during the last night, one might abduce that the conclusion is that it had rained during the last night. So this is something that we are abducing when we see something, or a kind of explaining or proposing a best explanation. So what happens in a best explanation is that you're seeing something, you're observing something, and based on your previous observation, you're saying that this is what happened, or this is the most probable thing to happen. So Brewer uses the idea of abduction in legal logic, and he says that when a judge when judge approaches a case, say situation A, judge is trying to classify this new case with which case in the past I can classify it or I can compare it. Then looking to the previous cases, he abduces a rule, a rule that can classify this new case under it. By testing this rule to other, then the judge actually looks into other previous cases, and then he evaluates this analogy warranting rule and checks it with other rationales that could be a compelling explanation of the analogy, and then he determines whether this is the analogy warranting rule or not. So there is an abduction, then there is an evaluation, then what actually happens in the end is a deductive reasoning. So this new rule, there will be a new rule, that rule becomes a deductive reasoning. So whatever case that comes into that rule, that becomes the rule of that case. So what happens in the end is a deduction. Basically, there are two problems with this method. One problem is that abduction is, so how this abduction happens? This also tends to fall in the category of the mystics. Basically, when he say abduction happens, he does not explain what is the exact method or what is the exact structure of the abduction, how that process is happening. There is no explanation of an abduction. And then in the second case, the problem is that an abductive argument is always a form of defeasible reasoning. I will come to what is defeasible reasoning. So that means any abductive reasoning cannot end into a deductive reasoning. There should be a method that can evaluate this conclusion all the way from that point onwards. That cannot end in a deductive form. To this problem, actually, Walton proposes a defeasible model. He says that in the end result of
Muhammad, you have taken 15 minutes so far.
See, okay.
Yes.
I will.
And you are still in the first one.
Okay, I will go fast. So Walton actually proposes some critical questions that can evaluate a defeasible argument. He says that in any case of legal analogy, there are like two premises that leads to a conclusion, and then one should ask a critical questions. Okay, so there are like 4 set of critical questions that we can ask against a legal analogy. Okay. So also, okay, I will take 5 minutes.
You can go to the conclusion directly and summarize the key idea.
Okay, definitely. Thank you. Okay, there's a huge problem here. Okay, then I will briefly explain Al-Ghazali's method. So Al-Ghazali and his approach to usul fiqh has been considered as a logical turn in usul fiqh. So Ghazali's model of qiyas is actually, he says that in a legal qiyas there should be a new premise, a new muqaddimah that can explain how two premises are leading to a conclusion. So that's what we know in usul fiqh as illah. So this illah is actually happens through an istinbat. Istinbat can be considered as a kind of abduction, and there is a clear method of how this istinbat is happening. There is a taqsim, there is a categorization of all the properties in that case, and then checking whether these properties can be the cause of the ruling. So there is a structure of istinbat basically. There are like explaining. So as we have seen in previous method, there is no structure of abduction, how that abduction happens, but Ghazali actually explains all this structure, and then also he approves that there is any qiyas that happens through istinbat is a zanni form of argument, which means a defeasible form of argument, and there should be a method that can evaluate this defeasibility, which he explains in his Jadal model. So basically in Jadal we have like some major forms of i'tirad, like 6 points of i'tirad. Then also say he like proposes some methods of answering to the same. So my conclusion in the end is that there are striking similarities in how Imam Ghazali is structuring the analogy and how Brewer and Douglas Walton is structuring the analogy. There is like huge striking similarity, but in the end what happens is that I can just take But in the end, what happens is that what Imam Ghazali is trying to prove is that to accommodate different disagreements. So if you can question an argument and that question can be answered through an answer, that means any question in legal analogy can have two different contradictory positions. So you will be continuing asking critical questions and continuing the answering to that critical question. So there is a continuation of disagreement. So he's showing that there is a clear logic of how disagreements in Islamic law happens. But in the another case, in modern tradition of law is that they're explaining all this method to arrive at a conclusion, a definite one point of conclusion. It's not to accommodate differences. It's not to accommodate, in law we cannot see any two different rulings in the same court. There should be a final ruling that is a definite ruling. So both traditions uses the same logic to prove two different and two contradictory kind of positions. Thank you all. Sorry for having
Thank you very much, Muhammad. To avoid Muhammad's mistake, I wrote my keynotes to try to stick with the time, especially when you have the authority to moderate. Huh? So fairness and being just is an essential point here. This is Muhammad's paper is an interesting paper that seeks to compare the logic of analogical reasoning in Islamic law, qiyas, especially in the work of Al-Ghazali with two key works, two key contemporary philosophers or theories from legal and informal logic. I mean, the two authors that he have mentioned, Scott Brewer and Douglas Walton. Let me start by briefly explaining each of these three approaches in simple terms. Let's start with the first one, Scott Brewer. So Scott Brewer's argument can be summarized or termed as legal theory abductive analogy. Scott Brewer views analogy as a process of abduction, or what we might call informed guessing. When a judge compares two legal cases, they are not just pointing to surface similarities. Instead, they are trying to uncover a general principle called an analogy warranting rule. That explains why the rule is in the first case should apply to the second case. So the analogy here is rational if the rule makes sense and can be generalized. It's a form of reasoning from specific examples to a broader legal form. So as for the second one, Douglas Walton it can be termed, his argument can be termed as informal logic, defeasible argument. Walton sees analogies as tentative or defeasible. That is, analogies can be useful and persuasive, but they are always open to challenge. They are always open to challenge. This is a very important point because I will go back again to this point later when I will speak about Al-Ghazali. He proposes, Douglas proposes a set of critical questions to test how strong an analogy is. For example, are the compared cases really similar? Or is there a relevant difference? So for Walton, analogy is a dialogical tool meant to be debated and refined, not accepted as final. So it's just a tool to make a dialogical, to make a progressive dialogue. So now let's move to the third case here in the comparison, which is Al-Ghazali, Al-Ghazali's case. So Al-Ghazali can be termed in the legal terminology as Islamic legal theory, usul al-fiqh, and specifically we refer here to qiyas. Al-Ghazali's theories of qiyas is much more than just comparing cases. He insists that the reason, illah, behind a legal ruling must be identified carefully. He develops tools like as-sabr wa taqsim, systematic elimination of possible causes, الطرد والقياس والعكس, sorry, testing consistency, and munasaba, evaluating suitability based on ethical aims. Moreover, Al-Ghazali acknowledges that qiyas yields probabilistic knowledge, not certainty, and he develops a whole dialectical system of objections and replies to evaluate it. In that sense, qiyas is both abductive and defeasible. The authors, Muhammad's paper, or Muhammad in his paper, his key claim is that Al-Ghazali combines the constructive logic of Breuer with the evaluative dialogue of Walton. This is the key argument that he argues in his paper. Although that he is, in his introduction, he explained that his purpose from this comparison, making this comparison or comparative analysis between the three authors. Still, I think when I read the paper, so I need to clarify more or comment more on the frame of comparative analysis. So the very frame itself. So the paper, while the paper is thought-provoking and shows sufficient knowledge of both Islamic and contemporary legal theory, I would like to raise some critical reflections, especially regarding the overall comparative framework. The paper seeks to position Al-Ghazali within models developed by Breuer and Walton, as if we must decide, is he closer to Breuer or Walton, or is he a mixture of them? But I believe this framing is too restrictive. Al-Ghazali does not need to be fitted into these models in order to be appreciated as logically rigorous or relevant. Or, I'm not saying that Muhammad is trying to say this, but it can be understood this way. So, Al-Ghazali does not need to, this does not mean we should avoid comparison. Quite the opposite. But comparison should clarify differences, not obscure them through forced equivalence. That's a difference between comparative insight and taxonomic assimilation. Breuer's model is formal and structural. It looks for coherence and generalization. Al-Ghazali, however, grounds his qiyas in moral and theological values, especially the purposes of the law, maqasid sharia. So the illah, reason, is not just a logical connector, it must be ethically suitable, which is a very an essential difference between the two theories. Reducing it to a structural analogy warranting rule misses this normative dimension. Walton's notion, or defeasible, is very open-ended. Anyone can challenge the analogy using critical questions. In contrast, Al-Ghazali develops a disciplined form of critique tied to the ethics of scholarly debate, آداب البحث والمناظرة. Objections like نقد or قلب follow recognized patterns. So while both systems are dialogical, the Islamic model is regulated by a shared epistemic tradition, not by open informal debate. So the paper treats qiyas mainly as a logical method, but in practice qiyas played a central role in madhab formation, institutional ijtihad, and legal authority. Al-Ghazali's theory cannot be separated from its role in the broader architecture of Islamic legal discourse, including the balance between unity and diversity. The contemporary models are often individualistic. Al-Ghazali's model supports collective reasoning within the tradition. And I refer here to the jurisprudential tradition in general, not just Al-Ghazali's approach as an individual. So the final insights in this paper that Al-Ghazali's theory allows for principled pluralism is both original and promising, but it remains underdeveloped. This idea deserves more space, that qiyas does not aim for a single correct answer, but for a range of justified views, each grounded in a disciplined reasoning process. This could serve as a counter model to contemporary legal systems that prioritize uniformity. To conclude, this paper is a valuable contribution to the growing conversation between Islamic jurisprudence and legal theory. Its detailed reading of Al-Ghazali is commendable, and the comparison with Brewer and Walton opens important questions. However, we must be careful not to confine classical Islamic thought within foreign conceptual boxes. Al-Ghazali's legal theory is not valuable because it mirrors modern logic, but because it offers an alternative model of rationality, one that is ethical, dialogical, and rooted in tradition. Thank you very much.
I wonder if Komath will respond to you.
Okay. Yeah. So I will. How much time do we have?
3 minutes, but we will make it 20.
So let's open.
It's only 3.
Only 3.
We can have 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Okay. Let's start with 3 minutes for the comment, and then we will open for discussion.
Okay, thank you for the comments. That were great, actually. And it's great how Dr. Muetaz Al-Khatib actually summarized all the arguments into a very great form. Thank you for that. I would like to add 2 comments, basically. So one thing is that, as I mentioned in the beginning itself, I don't believe that, okay, comparison is actually problematic. Definitely it is problematic. Many people agree to that. But what we need is like a politically conscious dialogue and comparison. That's what I actually insisted in the beginning itself. I don't think that I did insist on that very much in the paper, but I was making a conclusion in the end that though these 2 traditions have great similarities, striking similarities in how they explain the logical structure of the analogy, the end result, what they are actually doing in the end, is actually problematic. So when I say logic, definitely I agree with what Ghazali is proposing is also an ethical dimension. There is clearly an ethical dimension. But if we are actually thinking that ethical dimension actually comes as the part of the system of the logic. There is a logical structure of analogy, and he explains how this logical structure works from the beginning, of explaining what is istinbat, how istinbat happens, and in the structure of that istinbat, the ethics, or what we say today as maqasid al-sharia, actually comes at the end of that structure. And when we don't have many precedents that we can actually evaluate with, so maybe today, as maqasid al-sharia has become a independent discipline itself, I don't agree in the traditional way of understanding maqasid al-sharia was actually part of this structure of analogy, and how we make an analogy in a very logical, structured way, and explaining what is the structure of the making an analogy. And on the second point, what actually happens in the end, 1 minute, okay, definitely. What actually happens in the end, through both of these explanations, in what Douglas Walton and Brewer is doing, that they are trying to explain how we have to do the law, how we have to make a judgment in the court. So we have to arrive at a definite single one ruling. So we have to do this and do this. It's a procedural kind of system that guides the judges to arrive at one particular conclusion. Though this procedure is actually kind of similar, I'm not saying that it is the same system, but it has its own similarities with both traditions. What Ghazali is doing, that using the same structure, same logic, he is actually trying to argue that two different positions or two different analogies can have its own legitimacy, can have its own logical legitimacy as Islamic law itself works. So the madhab system, for example, if Hanafis have a qiyas and Shafis have a qiyas, he is responding in Mustasfa against those who accuse the qiyas as a form of zanni reasoning, a kind of probable reasoning, and that it will lead to contradiction, it will lead to disagreements. There are like Ithna Ashari usulis, like Ainul Qudat, I don't remember exactly the name. There are like Ithna Ashari jurists who says that you cannot use qiyas in law because that will lead to disagreements, that will lead to contradictions. Then Ghazali responds, no. See, there is a clear logic, and he's explaining the logic of disagreements. He's explaining the logic of contradictions. It's at least that what I understand. Maybe it's not explicitly stated in Usul al-Fiqh, but what I understand from his engagements with the other opponents, and how he's trying to explain it, and how he's basing all his arguments on the logical way, as it is very clear from the Muqaddimah itself. So this is what I understand. So, great, thank you.
Thank you very much. Two quick points, just commenting on what he said, and then I will give you the floor. The first one, briefly. So I didn't say that the comparison itself, the very comparative analysis, is problematic. No, the way that you frame the comparative analysis, the argument that you make from the comparative analysis. You see, so this is number one. Number two, briefly also, when I refer al-qiyas in the four fiqh schools. Qiyas is a legitimate, and there's an agreement on using qiyas as a tool for conducting rulings. So this is number one. Number two, within the qiyas, the term munasaba, appropriateness, which the very essence of maqasid sharia, is an integral and structural part of analogy within the juristic discussions. So it's not just, it doesn't come at the end. No, it's an essential part. So munasaba is, and Al-Ghazali mainly developed the term of munasaba intensively in his other fiqh works, especially the work that he dedicated for qiyas. And it was developed later intensively in the other schools. This is why Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, refer to this idea, those who, and refer to Al-Juwayn and Al-Ghazali mainly. So this is not, this is an ended discussion about the munasaba, which is an essential part of qiyas and the argumentation itself. So Al-Ghazali does not, we have to differentiate between argumentation itself as an art, and argumentation as a purposeful tool for meeting or reaching out the objective. So qiyas with or analogy can be used as an art to argue and to gain the result. You know, so this is the very difference with Al-Ghazali's approach. He does not deal with a qiyas as an art, because you can know and you have the ability or and the skills to argue and to gain the discussion, but you know in yourself that you are defending a wrong position. Okay, now the floor is open for you. Okay, Karim, yeah.
Thank you. I love it. And I think that, okay, so my question will come in a bit. Before the question, I'm going to give a reading of the entire debate and the presentation, the commentary, etc. And then the question would be, do you think my reading is completely off or on target? And this is a question, I think, for both, I mean, if I may. So it seems to me that what we have is, first, Komath, what he did is he gave us, he looked at analogical reasoning as a method, or the method of analogical reasoning, and he said, well, there are similarities between two traditions, the same method. They reach different conclusions, right? On the one hand, we have the conclusion is, therefore we can have a judgment. On the other, the second conclusion with the Ghazali's case is, actually, this is why this agreement keeps going. So at this point, someone, I mean, the most natural, and this is not something that I saw in the presentation, the most natural question is, okay, what do you deduce from that? Does this mean we have to give up analogical reasoning? Does this mean, and what is the lesson that we draw? And I think this is where the comment becomes fundamental, because the comment, as I understand it, is actually you cannot have a juz'i look at this. You cannot look at a method of analogical reasoning in the abstract. Now it's been formulated as an art, right? So therefore, you have, if you widen the scope and you bring in, for example, the Maqasid al-Sharia perspective, or why is Ghazali looking at the method of analogical reasoning, you realize that actually there are other things. And I think this relates very nicely with the way Komath opened the discussion, which is a question about comparative. What is comparison? And the reply is, one way to read the response is, well, comparative study cannot be juz'i. It has to be, I don't want to say kulli, because it cannot be kulli, but we have to broaden the perspective as much as we can. So I don't think there is any kind of disagreement, and maybe this is what Dr. Muetaz meant when he said the framing of. He's not. Anyway, so I wonder if this reading, I mean, they seem to be very complementary, and I think the serious question, and this is something that goes way beyond debate or munazara, or I mean, how do you do comparison? Yeah, sorry.
This is the question, yeah. Any other question? Yes, please. Here, this side. And then I will come back to you. Yeah.
Thank you, Muhammad. Hello. Thank you. This is a question, it's a very broad question, and it's not necessarily the sort of question that you can answer now, but think about for the future, and we'll talk about it. Very broad. But I mean, it's clear that throughout its long developmental history, that Sunni, we're talking about Sunni usul al-fiqh, has developed and refined and continually debated a very sophisticated body of qiyas theory, including what excites me the most, qiyas-oriented dialectic, right? It's filled with riches. and you've given us a tiny picture of that. And at the very least, these riches can serve as inspiration for solutions in modern problems of legal reasoning, if not actually offer outright solutions. And as you note, this has been argued before, and to some extent tested and proven by scholars like Shahidur Rahman and his co-authors. And you're arguing it again and showing us again. My question is, looking forward, and you've got a nice, beautiful career ahead of you with an excellent beginning, and thinking in terms of systematic, step-by-step kind of research program, and considering remarks that have been made by our colleagues here, and also considering especially the great number of refined qiyas theory works and the great plurality of qiyas theory details and methods. It's not one unitary method. You know, there's tons and tons and tons of debate about the right ways to do qiyas, the masalik of the illah, the shurut of the illah, all of these things are debated. What do you think is the best way forward to systematically and positively, constructively bring this intellectual wealth of 1,000 years of great minds thinking on the topic to the attention of modern global theorists of legal argumentation?
Okay, the last question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I love the presentation and the comment. What I understand is, in the hands of Douglas Walton, I saw as if the logic is diminished into demonstrative logic, only Burhan. But if we are able to invite abduction into logic, qiyas into logic, we can broaden the perspective of logic. By the way, there is this very important guy who is called Dave Snowden, who came up with this Kühnefin framework. In complex systems, actually, we are using abduction. And in novel situations, we as humans, all the time we are using abduction. It's like how we will make decisions in the complexity or where there is uncertainty. So we definitely use abduction, and it seems in Ghazali, abduction is invited into logic. Maybe it was already, maybe the modern theorists somehow just dismissed it. Can we say this? What do you think?
I will quickly respond in one response to all these three questions. So maybe briefly, it's 3 minutes. So I have not been time conscious, sorry for that. About comparison, definitely. I believe in this idea of communicative action that Habermas always talks about. So what the idea is that dialogue should be the normative system, not to find a consensus, not to arrive at a point that we all are the same or there is some kind of meta language of everything. No, kind of doing the communicative action, doing the dialogue all the time between, not just between the people, but between different traditions, different forms of reason, different forms of knowledge. Not to say that this is relevant because of that tradition, this is relevant because Western, there is a problem in the West, no. But kind of to understand how we have some forms of shared reasoning and many forms of radically different forms of thinking. So this is something we have to acknowledge. And I think maybe the word that, maybe one of the most significant and so rich, as Young mentioned, very much rich and having a kind of very depth, the tradition is that Islamic tradition, basically. Many scholars are engaging with. And when we see the works of Shahid Rahman or Young himself or many other works, or the works that has been being done by many scholars here, and even so the thing is that we have to bring all those treasures into out and show that this actually solves the problem that we have today in our own thinking, in our own ways of thinking, and show that how we have to think in a different way, or how we have to recognize different forms of thinking. And on the second point about usul al-fiqh, and so So there is a problem with everyone. Maybe like I wanted to see the relevance of something that in our tradition. And seeing that relevance is asking the question that we have been hearing from different education systems. And so basically when we look into usul al-fiqh, we have different forms of ideas like ijma or qiyas. And ijma basically like what is in usul al-fiqh is a kind of pragmatic approach to reason, not as in mantiq, but a very much pragmatic. Sometimes Al-Ghazali actually says that if you are stating a claim and you are giving the dalil, you don't have to expect the mutanadhir. You don't have to expect that mutanadhir will argue something like this or that. The idea is that how the logic works in a very pragmatic way is that you will say something, you will say your argument, and you will give the dalil, and then it is upon the mutanadhir to show the counter argument. So there is basically a pragmatic approach to logic. Even when Ghazali discusses about the hujjiyatul qiyas, he actually shows that these kind of dhanni arguments, kind of defeasible forms of reasoning, have been used in a very practical life, in daily life, in different forms of legal reasoning. So he's showing this pragmatic approach to logic. So we can see that. So that's also the same thing about the Burhani. So usul al-fiqh, what I understand is that usul al-fiqh is a kind of was a product of a realization that ilm al-mantiq, the Aristotelian logic, cannot explain many things that we have in usul al-fiqh. So that's kind of from that conviction that ilm al-mantiq is not enough to explain the structures of our arguments in fiqh. That's what leads to the idea of systematizing theories in legal reasoning in the field.
Okay, thank you very much. Almost done? Okay. So just a quick note, the theory of qiyas analogy within the Islamic tradition has a very long history. For example, start with Imam Shafi'i himself, and there are several studies on analogy in the works of Shafi'i. So even Shafi'i restricted ijtihad in general, the independent legal reasoning, to qiyas. So he said that wal-ijtihadu al-qiyas. So he didn't include any other tools, but the Shafi'is later included other tools to conduct rulings. So the analogy itself that has developed over history from different sources. So this is number one. Number two, I will conclude with this point. So as I said, that I'm not against of the comparative analysis. So, but we have to be aware when we compare different things, especially from different traditions and different contexts, or different even period of times. So we have to consider the spirit of the time, or the key characteristics of the context, or the systematic, structure of the tradition that you are comparing. When you especially when you compare between a specific, when you compare between two different traditions or discourses, and what do they say about the same thing? Because at the end, analogy within the fiqhi tradition or usuli tradition, Islamic legal theory, so it's part of a very comprehensive and complicated structure, and it functions within this structure, and it is based on theological, moral, and religious assumptions that motivated this tool to be implemented. So I cannot just cut off with and take the only specific piece and to compare it with other discussions from different traditions in different contexts, and while I'm ignoring the function of the tool that I'm using within the whole structure or the system of thinking, which is immersed in morality, worldview, religious motivations. When you use analogy to catch the essence of the divine will, it's radically different when you use analogy, to conduct any other ruling, or judgment that we face in the legal system, in the state law. I mean, you see, This is a very essential point that we have to consider. So this is why I'm not objecting on the comparison itself. I'm questioning the frame, the methodology or the purposes behind this comparative analysis. Thank you very much. Thank you, Muhammad.